We are paid, that's all. We are God.
Yo guys! I'm Yuruzi. I'm back with the part 4. This is what if Naruto was sent to the world of Inuyasha. Naruto has lost everything in the final battle. He is asked to aid a group in their journey. But will his own grief and pain get in the way? Or will this new group heal his broken soul? Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 19, Fall into Despair. The sound of soft chuckling could be heard as Naruto and Sango walked down a worn dirt path that led to the Demon Slayer's village, and then Shippo dumped the entire bottle of salt in Inuyasha's eyes. It was so hilarious seeing Inuyasha screaming his head off as he ran around like a lunatic. Naruto chuckled silently and Kagura purred with amusement from her perch on the Slayer's shoulder, yet the comfortable atmosphere shattered abruptly as they went over the next hill and the remains of the Slayer's village came into view. Sango's eyes immediately clouded with sadness and her form slumped slightly. Naruto as well felt a slight feeling of nostalgia. It was so similar. Both of their pains came from this. He felt as if he was back in the burning remnants of his village. Nothing more than smoke, ash and charred remains with which to bury the memories of those he once loved. He sighed and once again his mask came to his defense. He turned to Sango and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Are you alright?" She took a deep breath and nodded solemnly. "Yeah, it doesn't really go away, you know." Naruto nodded and tore his gaze away. If she only knew. He stepped forward and made his way towards the village. Sango stood for a few more seconds before slowly following. It was several hours later when Sango finally deemed her weapon sufficiently repaired for the night. It wasn't perfect, but she had been working since they had arrived and she was tired and sweaty from working in the forge. Naruto had offered to help her, but these were secrets that were passed on from one demon slayer to another, not something for outsiders to learn, even though there may not be a next generation of demon slayers. She sighed as she took the hirekatsu and placed it on a rack on the wall. She would put the finishing touches on the thing tomorrow. She looked out and noticed that the sun was now going down. She looked alarmed. She had been there for more than half the day and had left Naruto alone in an empty village with nothing to do. She hadn't even showed him the archives so she could actually see what he was looking for. She immediately walked out of the hut that housed the forge works and found Kagura in her full demon form laying across the porch resting. One of her cat ears twitched as the Nico heard Sango's arrival and a single lazy eye opened to look upon the demon slayer. Sango smiled down at her longtime partner and spoke. "Kagura, where is Naruto?" The fire cat pointed one of her tails off behind a few huts. Sango smiled and nodded before walking off in the direction the cat indicated. It was after a few seconds that Sango noticed that Kagura had pointed to the graveyard. She began feeling slightly queasy as she approached the area. She began wondering if Naruto had gone to pay his respects to the dead. The thought surprised her. Few people passed through a decimated village and paid their respects to the dead. In fact, few even bothered to bury them, let alone pray for them. When she finally caught sight of the blonde, she could see him kneeling before the graves and praying. Just as he detected her presence, he ceased his prayers and stood as he turned to face her with a small sad smile on his face. "It is not much, but..." She immediately interrupted him. No, thank you for the thought." She looked saddened for a moment before she shook her head and smiled at him. "I'm finished for today. I was thinking that perhaps we could go to the archives and search for the demon you wanted to look up." Naruto looked towards the setting sun before he spoke again. "Are you sure? I don't mind waiting until tomorrow if you wish to rest." She shook her head. No, if we do it today we can get a good start early tomorrow morning." Naruto shrugged. "Alright, whatever you say." It was only a few minutes later the two of them found themselves walking down a dark corridor that led to the Demon Slayer's archives. Naruto eyed the Demon Slayer walking beside him and soon spoke. "Sango, may I ask you something?" "You just did," she said back rather playfully as she turned and gave him a small smirk. Naruto raised an eyebrow at her sly comment and offered a smirk of his own. "Well then, I'll ask you something else then." She nodded and looked on ahead. "Go on." He seemed contemplative for a moment before he spoke. How did you cope with it? The death of all your loved ones?" Is it the simple drive of revenge that helps you keep on going? He asked as he placed his eyes back on her form. Sango stopped walking and looked down to the floor while biting her lower lip in thought. Her bangs covered her eyes, and for a moment Naruto thought he may have intruded on something a bit too personal. After a few seconds though, Sango spoke again. It was really hard at first, you know. Even when I wanted revenge, first on Inuyasha and then on Naraku, I just felt like you wanted to give it up. He finished in his mind but said nothing and let her continue. But then I found out Kohaku was still alive. She smiled sadly at that. Now, I have hope again. As long as Kohaku is alive and there's a chance of him being rescued, I think I can go on. At least for him, so that he doesn't have to go through what I went through. When I thought I was the last, you know. Naruto nodded and smiled gently at her. Sango then shook her head to push the sad thoughts away. Anyway, let's just find what you came to look for. Naruto nodded and they continued to make their way inside. Have you found it yet? Sango asked from her place near the entrance. Naruto gave a simple HN as he continued searching through scrolls on ancient fox demons. Many of them had just pissed off a lord or two for stealing heirlooms and stuff of that nature, others had just pissed off a few villages. None could truly come even close to the being that he was looking for. But still, the Slayer's archives were impressive. The cave chamber they were in now was about 50 feet in diameter and about 70 feet high, with dozens of scrolls stacked one on top of the other in an organized fashion. The most recent demons were near the entrance and the oldest ones were deeper in. They had everything from dogs to wolves to snakes, foxes, dragons, spiders, and an innumerable amount of other demonic specimens. He sighed and was about to give up when an old, worn, dusty scroll placed in the back, in a corner caught his eye. It was definitely old, probably the oldest one here. He reached in and grabbed it. He coughed as the movement picked up dust and threw it right in his face. Sango noticed this and immediately walked over. Found anything? Naruto shrugged and began unrolling the scroll. Let's see. He unrolled the ancient text, picking up more dust. The kanji were blurred and worn from the moisture and time but were slightly legible. 99 beasts with Yulan power breathe destruction, the end of all things. Well, that answered his question. It was definitely what he was looking for, but the kanji were too worn to be read correctly. He unrolled the scroll some more where he came across a painting. He immediately recognized two of the beasts portrayed in it. Shikaku and Kyubi. They were arranged in a circle with Kyubi's form in the center. Each had their own background but Kyubi's was the most curious. A forest in flames, how accurate. He sighed and rolled it back up before placing it back where he found it. He stood and smiled to Sango, who was looking at the scroll curiously. Well, I couldn't find anything, thanks for helping, Sango. She smiled at him and nodded. You go on ahead, I want to look up something. Naruto shrugged and walked away. Sango waited until he was gone before she moved and picked up the scroll he had previously been reading. She unrolled it fully and scanned context. She immediately noticed the fox demon with 9 tails in the center of the portrait inside the scroll. She looked on and one kanji immediately caught her eye. Jinchuriki. It was one of the few words that were clearly legible on the scroll, but nevertheless it was there. She narrowed her eyes in thought. If this was any indication, then this was indeed the scroll that Naruto had been looking for. But why would he say differently? She looked back at the 9-tailed fox in the picture and immediately knew that there was some form of connection here. She looked back to where it said Jinchuriki and tried to read the broken text. Jinchuriki only OTH stop, 9. Well, it wasn't perfect but it more or less gave her an idea. The Jinchuriki were supposedly the only ones that could beat these creatures. So, could Naruto be looking for this creature to defeat it? It was a rational thought considering he was so powerful. Maybe she should take this to Kagome, maybe someone in her time could find a way to read this. She silently rolled up the scroll and pocketed it, out of sight from the blonde. The two made their way back to the village in a comfortable silence, each pondering their own thoughts. But that was interrupted as Naruto's sharp sense of smell picked up a rather alarming scent, blood. Sango, hurry up, Kirara's in trouble. He yelled before sprinting off to the village. Sango was thrown into shock for a brief moment before she began running as well, all the while praying that Kirara was alright. Naruto was obviously the first to reach the village and found Kirara sprawled on the ground with a huge gash running across her right shoulder blade all the way down to her left hind leg. Blood caked her normally porcelain fur and her normally bright red eyes were dilated and unfocused. She was alive but was going to need some serious medical attention and for the bleeding to stop. Naruto, not being anything close enough to a medic to heal this properly, did the only thing he could think of. He took out a kunai and with a small fire jutsu heated up the weapon and slowly cauterized the injury. Kirara hissed and growled in pain and he had to use 2 shadow clones to keep her from thrashing around in her unconscious state. Just as he had finished, Sango arrived and skidded to a kneeling position next to them. "What happened?" she asked anxiously as she began checking Kirara over. "I don't know, I found her like this. I managed to stop the bleeding so she should be alright for now, if there isn't any internal bleeding. Go and grab your weapon, whoever did this might still be around." Sango nodded and with a final concerned glance towards Kirara she rushed to go and get her gear. Naruto stood and extended his senses to try and find whoever had done this and immediately felt it. No, he felt 2 presences. One was unmistakably Naraku but the other was one he didn't recognize. So it wasn't one of his detachments. A few moments later Sango came out with her weapon in hand and her armor already in place. Naruto nodded and pointed to where he had sensed their opponents. "They're over there." She nodded and together they sprinted toward their destination. It was only a few seconds later when the two came across a sight that made Sango's blood run cold. It was Naraku, holding up her younger brother Kohaku, by his throat. The younger boy was struggling against his grip but it was futile. The dark Hanyu smiled cruelly in their direction. "Ah, Sango, so glad you could join us." His eyes darkened at the sight of the blonde however but the smirk never left his face. "And I see that you are here as well." Naruto's features for once were cold and impassive. His mind was running a mile a minute trying to figure out just what the Hanyu hopped to gain through this. Naraku smirked and tightened his grip on Kohaku's throat. "Well Sango, you see, your brother has outlived his usefulness now that his memories have returned to him. And so, I have a proposition for you my dear." Naruto noticed how her grip seemed to tighten on the Hireikatsu indicating her anger and desperation. Naraku continued after a few moments of tense silence. "The rules are quite simple. You have 2 minutes to save your precious brother. Should you fail, I will kill him. Should you succeed then he will live. Simple, correct?" He smirked that condescending smirk of his. "Oh, and there's just one more condition. The ninja cannot interfere." Naruto tensed. This was a trap and he could see that from about 10 miles away with a blindfold on. He was setting her up for a fall that would drive her to the brink of her sanity. Sango however didn't think of such things and with speed that surprised Naruto her Hireikatsu was sailing through the air aiming to chop off Naraku's arm. The cruel demon smirked before he leapt back to avoid the weapon. Sango drew 5 shuriken and tossed them at the Hanyu. Naraku's smirk darkened before he did the last thing Sango and even Naruto expected. He put Kohaku in the way of the projectiles. The young boy let out a strangled cry as the sharp objects dug into his right shoulder and another in his hip and the last just beneath his ribs. Tears leaked from his eyes as he turned them to meet Sango. "Sister!" he gasped softly as he struggled for breath as Naraku held his throat. Naruto gritted his teeth and made to take a step forward when he noticed Naraku's cold red eyes turn to him. The dark Hanyu gave a smirk that seemed to say, "Just try it." Naruto's glare darkened considerably and he promised himself one thing: this bastard was going to pay. Sango lost some of her strength at the sight of her brother's anguish and the fact that he had called her sister in a way that seemed to ask, why? But with a shake of her head she steeled her resolve and with a soft ring her sword was unsheathed. She rushed at Naraku and caught the Hireikatsu mid-stride as it came back to her. Naraku smirked coldly again and sent some of his tentacles to attack the approaching Tajia. Sango sidestepped the attack and continued her charge. When she was right in front of Naraku she dug her left foot into the dirt and with a diagonal upward swing from right to left, moved to slice Naraku's throat open. With that same smirk plastered on his face the Hanyu stepped back and once again put Kohaku in the path of her strike. Sango tried to stop but she was moving far too fast and with a sickening slice the sword bit deep into Kohaku's side. The boy let out a strangled yell and before Sango could react Naraku roughly pulled him away, causing the blade to cause even more pain and damage to the young boy. Sango felt tears of rage and sadness well up in her eyes and trail down her cheeks. This being was truly heartless. Naruto desperately wanted to move but with Naraku's eyes on him he couldn't even afford to make hand seals for a shadow clone. The dark Hanyu smirked and leaned to the side to avoid the Hireikatsu. He then took to the skies, a cloud of miasma at his feet. "Time's up my dear Sango." He spoke in a condescending tone of voice. Sango's breath became ragged and came in short hard pants. Her anger, desperation was almost a palpable thing. She caught the Hireikatsu again and with a mighty swing in which she poured all of her anger, her sadness, her desperation, her drive. She put everything in it. The Hireikatsu sailed through the air, but with a casual shrug Naraku floated slightly to the side, avoiding it completely. "You failed, demon slayer," he said mockingly. He turned his head slightly to the side and saw the Hireikatsu coming back around. He smirked. How fitting. Naruto and Sango both gasped in horror as Naraku tossed Kohaku in the path of the massive boomerang with a casual flick of his wrist. "No! Damn it! From that height I don't think I can make it in time," Naruto thought as he rushed forward in a last-ditch effort to save the young boy. It was all for naught however, as with a sickening crunch and crack the Hireikatsu slammed into Kohaku's back and sent him crashing to the ground below. "Kohaku!" Sango cried out as she ran towards her fallen brother. Naruto landed on the ground and turned to glare at the smirking parasite. His eyes were as sharp as daggers and promised pure pain to the heartless monster. "Kohaku!" Sango cried as she knelt next to him and turned him over, to notice that he was still alive. His breathing was extremely labored and he was barely hanging on. "Kohaku, please don't die, I'll heal you, just, please don't die." She sobbed as tears came down unbidden. Kohaku's next words, however, would shatter her. "Sister," he rasped out, why did you let him kill me?" he whispered hoarsely before life left him. Naruto winced as he caught the words with his sharp sense of hearing and immediately noticed a Shirkan shard, tainted to the point where it was almost black, zipped toward Naraku. The Hanyu gave off a smirk before he vanished in a cloud of purple miasma. It was then that Naruto knew beyond doubt that Naraku had come here to break Sango. Kohaku was still under his control the whole time, now he just had to convince Sango of that fact. Sango's features were in absolute horror. Kohaku's last words echoing in her mind. Tears trailed freely down her cheeks and her form shook violently. She felt a hand her shoulder and shakily looked up to find Naruto using an expression that was sad yet somewhat understanding. She sobbed and her form shook more. Naruto silently knelt down and wrapped her in a gentle, comforting embrace. That was all it took for the little remaining walls around her emotions to crumble, and she cried. She cried hysterically, and all the pent-up emotions she had stored within her came forth in terrible, heart-wrenching sobs. Naruto held her gently, rocking her back and forth as she sobbed and shook in his arms. "Go on, Sango. Cry all you want. No one will fault you on this day." She cried well into the night, and when she was done Naruto silently carried her back to her home and then prepared Kohaku's grave. Naruto sighed as he covered the grave and gave the young boy a silent prayer. He had to find a way to help Sango now. If he didn't, she may take her own life, from either guilt because of Kohaku's last words or despair because of his death. He then felt another presence and stiffened. He slowly looked to the tree line of the nearby forest when he saw the feudal version of Uchiha Itachi emerged from the darkness of the trees. Clad all in white, it could only be the Teiokai of the West. "Sesshomaru," he said as he narrowed his eyes. Somehow he doubted the demon lord came to enjoy tea. Chapter 20, Teiokai of the West. Naruto wiped his hands from the grave soil as he stood, straightening his umbu armor and wiping the sweat off his brow before he began walking to meet the demon lord. He placed his hands in his pockets and walked forward, thinking of any and all tricks he could pull out of his bag of tricks if the situation got too out of hand. Truly, facing the demon lord was not something he really wanted to do. The Teiokai was powerful and had a sharp mind. A dangerous and in this case, very deadly combination. In all honesty, he wasn't sure if he could win. Facing Inuyasha's group was a far cry in comparison to him. Even though Naruto really had no fear of death, his worry was for the demon slayer that currently rested. Kohaku's death alone may drive her to the brink of suicide. His death, coming so soon after his, may just be enough of a shock to drive her over the edge. If he died, he doubted it would affect the Inu group for long. They may be saddened, but because he was relatively new to the group, he was certain they'd get over it. Sango, however, was an entirely different story. If she died, the team would falter, and Inuyasha's way of mourning or burying his emotions so he wouldn't have to deal with them, which was lashing out at everyone and keeping himself active. In other words, rushing everyone to hunt shards wouldn't help the situation. "Ichen, I suppose I had better not die yet, eh?" Sesshomaru watched as the seemingly ordinary being began walking forward. It baffled him, even so close he could only faintly detect the underlying power he carried. He was no fool. This person, even if he was not as powerful as he possessed skills that were a complete mystery to him that provided him a definite edge. Naruto's eyes widened in alarm as he saw the demon's only arm grasp the hilt of Tokujin. Before he could do much else other than take out two kunai, the Teiokai rushed forward, his after-images trailing behind him. Naruto acted on instinct, his time in the war with Oto showing through as he put both kunai on a direct intercept path with Tokujin. The blades met with an audible clang. Naruto felt his eyes widen even further as Tokujin pulsed a fierce blue before Sesshomaru's yoki exploded forth. Sesshomaru looked at the dirt in front of him, now no more than mud and ashes. Is this it? He mentally sneered. His senses were able to pick up the faint whizzing sound of a kunai. He leaned to the side, barely dodging as it grazed his cheek. He turned around and found Naruto. His armor and mask were shredded to mere rags that barely clung to him. Not even the Kawarimi was able to help him fully escape the alleged dragon blast, the attack that could match the wind scar. He ripped off his face mask, revealing the whiskered features to another for the first time in over 7 months. His eyes were sharp and cold as ice as he stared at the Teiokai. Sesshomaru elegantly turned and settled his sword in a comfortable stance. The demon didn't answer before he rushed forward again. Naruto leapt back as he reappeared with a swing to where he had previously been standing. Sesshomaru moved to leap at him, but when he saw the blonde begin to make the same strange hand signals he had seen beforehand during the battle near the western lands, he held back. Katan, Ryuka no Jutsu. The blonde yelled as he fired several decent-sized fireballs at the Teiokai. Sesshomaru's eyes widened by a margin, the only action that showed his surprise at this attack. Nevertheless, he moved with grace and precision as he glided his way through the fireballs and toward the blonde that was still in midair. Naruto's eyes widened as he saw Sesshomaru coming at him. He narrowed his eyes and reared back his hand, and a Rasengan was soon formed, its flickering blue light shining brightly. Sesshomaru was already moving too fast to stop and knew that this attack, just by the look of it, may just cripple even one such as himself with a single blow. Since he couldn't stop, or shift to the side, he placed Tokujin in front of him as a form of a shield, with his yoki pulsing through it to make sure it didn't break under this attack. Naruto yelled as he slammed the Rasengan right into Tokujin. Yoki and chakra clashed, shockwaves that sent bits and pieces of energy tearing into the landscape around them. Deep lacerations and jagged chunks of earth rose as the attacks raged on. With a final shockwave from the Rasengan, Sesshomaru was sent back down to earth while a pulse from Tokujin cut deep, terrible cuts as if done by a blunt knife up Naruto's forearm. Naruto hissed slightly and then felt his chakra form and focus itself on the injuries, healing them subconsciously. Sesshomaru narrowed his eyes at this. An enemy that could heal any injury so rapidly was a formidable opponent indeed. He healed at an accelerated rate, but this was nothing short of regeneration. The blonde's mind was working to find a reason for this. Only two presented themselves. One, he thought him a threat, or he's testing himself. The blonde thought to himself with a slight narrowing of his eyes. This guy was reminding him way too much of Itachi, and that was not a good thing. Before he could contemplate it further, Sesshomaru raised Tokujin into the air and came down with a sweeping motion. In seconds, blue waves of energy tore through the landscape heading straight for him. Doton, Doryahiki, he said as he slammed both palms on the ground. A wall of earth came in between himself and the blue energy. He raised an arm to shield his eyes as the earth wall exploded. Sesshomaru watched the dust cloud with wariness. He had seen the earth rise to defend the ninja. Could that be his power? Control over the elements? Before he could contemplate it, however, he saw 4 of the blondes emerge from the dust cloud. He stiffened. What was this? These techniques would take any demon decades to master. Control of the elements was all but unheard of. An illusionist who could fool even his senses by giving each of these copies a scent, as well as an aura and sound as their foots hit the earth. Such a mastery of illusion was almost unseen by anyone other than the heads of kitsune families. Yet many of those had lived hundreds of years, and possessed knowledge and experience far beyond that of mortal men. How is it then, that this one can make illusions far more effective than even those beings? The 4 ninjas blurred into existence, surrounding him. He eyed them cautiously as he shifted his weight to his right leg, ready to spring on a moment's notice. The real Naruto formed his hand seals and slammed his hands on the ground. Doton Yomi Numa, he yelled, and in seconds the earth was a swampy mud pit that went up to their ankles, in which Sesshomaru found he could barely move. The other Naruto clones formed their own hand seals. Katan, Karyu Enden. Suetun Suryuden no Jutsu. Doton Doryuden. Sesshomaru watched in fascination as the 4 dragons, of earth, fire and water, seemed to form by the ninja's will and charge at him from 3 different directions. He absently noted that the copy's hand vanished, their energy no doubt used to create this attack. His mind worked at a fast pace trying to find a way to escape this situation. The best way would be to leap up, but with this strange mud on his feet he could barely move. His eyes shifted to the fire dragon that was coming at him and heard cracks and pops in the earth as the mud hardened due to the heat. That's it, he thought before pouring his acidic/poisonous yoki to the earth surrounding his feet. The mud hardened and with a forceful leap, Sesshomaru was free. Naruto was definitely surprised by this. No one was able to escape the Yomi Numa before so quickly, at least, not while fighting him. Sesshomaru ignored the flying rubble and debris as the three dragons crashed into each other and shot forward, his after images blurring and distorting his movements. Naruto, not expecting the demon lord's escape, much less the attack, wasn't able to do much more than shift his position so as not to hit anything vital, before Tokujin was run right through his chest. He gasped and coughed up blood, the thick red liquid falling to their feet. Sesshomaru stared at the human with a blank expression. Is this the power of the so-called ancient? Naruto chuckled, even though the action caused him pain. Sesshomaru thought the human was insane, but then felt a swift arm snake around his neck and tighten painfully, nearly cutting off his oxygen. He craned his neck back and found another of the copies with the bright blue ball of energy in his palm. He moved to pull out Tokujin and swipe when the real Naruto grasped his arm and held it there. Sesshomaru narrowed his eyes. How he hated Inuyasha. If he had another arm he could most likely escape this situation. Naruto chuckled hoarsely. Well then, now we find ourselves in a peculiar situation, don't we, Sesshomaru? The dog demon narrowed his eyes at the human. I don't know why you came here, and quite frankly, I don't care. You are a useful albeit unwilling ally in the fight against Naraku. So whatever your reasons, let's call it a draw for tonight, and if you want, after Naraku is defeated we can have our fight to the death. He paused. Or, you can push your yoki into Tokujin, killing me, and my clone slams that nice blue ball of energy into your side, which will most likely shred your lungs and plenty of major arteries to little bits. Somehow, I doubt that even you would survive that. Sesshomaru's eyes narrowed further. To be forced to compromise with a human, it was insulting, and yet, he felt some semblance of respect for this one. He then found something quite peculiar. His scent carries no fear. Demonic gold met tranquil blue for several moments before Sesshomaru pulled the blade out with a slicing sound. The real Naruto clutched his bleeding injury, that was already beginning to heal. He watched the Teiokai warily. When Sesshomaru sheathed his blade he dispelled his clone. They locked gazes again for a few moments before Sesshomaru turned and left, without so much as a backwards glance. Naruto waited until the Teiokai was well out of his vision before he collapsed, clutching his chest. He had miscalculated, the strike had hit his left lung. His chakra may know how to heal it, but it was taking very long in comparison to what Kyubi would have been able to accomplish. He picked himself up and walked over to a nearby tree and sat down with his back leaning against it. He would wait until it was healed, then he would go find some new clothes, and then he would go to Sango. His eyes slowly got heavier and heavier, until he slowly drifted off. A lizard yokai that had watched the entire scene chuckled in amusement as he watched the strange yet powerful human fall asleep near the tree due to the pheromones he had sent into the air. Yes. It hissed. I eat this human and I get its power, then I find more like him and become most powerful. Its chuckling was a disgusting hiss of a sound. Excuse me. The lizard heard behind him. He turned his head and was only able to catch a faint flicker of red before a flash of claws, then nothing. Sango lay huddled on the tatami mat in her hut, the shadows of the room outlined by pale moonlight, her hair drenched in sweat, her eyes pink and puffy from tears. Everything hurt so much, Kohaku's last words echoing in her mind, each driving another nail into her already wounded heart. Sister, why did you kill me? Her eyes traveled to the glinting kunai knife that lay on the floor. Her mind was numb, her eyes were blank, and her soul was already dead. She gripped the handle. Naruto awoke with a start and got to his feet fast as he noticed something. He was fully clothed. His mask, his armor, everything was as if he never fought with the demon lord. He thought for a brief moment that the encounter had been nothing more than a dream when he caught sight of the definitely changed landscape due to the battle. He stared at the fingerless gloves on his hands for several moments before another scent, one that sent his heart into his stomach, reached him. Blood. Sango's blood. Oh no. He rushed off in a blur of yellow and black, and in seconds he arrived at Sango's hut. What he saw made his heart drop even further. No. He whispered as the shadows seemed to grow much darker even as red stained the floor. Chapter 21, A Cruel Kindness. The sun slowly rose over the mountains that covered the landscape over feudal Japan. Its golden visage rose to the sky and warm rays of light blanketed over the now destroyed village of the demon slayers. The sounds of birds chirping and the smell of the warm misty morning air all gave way into a scene of peaceful harmony. However, within the village, one lone shinobi was watching over the near-dead form of the last of the demon slayers. His eyes shone sadness and pity toward her. Yet there was something more, a deep, almost undetectable understanding lay in his eyes. He sighed as Kirara, in her smaller form, mewed sadly as she sat down next to her master. She looked up at him with those big red eyes that seemed to show confusion, almost as if she was asking why. He sighed sadly as he stood, grabbing a bucket to go get some water down the stream. He didn't have the answers for the small cat. No, he should rephrase, he did not want to give her the answers. For they reminded him too much of his own heart. Before he reached the exit, he heard a faint groan come from his patient. He sighed. This was a confrontation he wasn't sure he was ready for. He turned and kneeled at her side, watching as her eyes slowly fluttered open. Her eyes stung horribly, her whole body felt weak and numb. For a moment she felt as if this was death, the escape she had sought to end her pain. But those thoughts vanished when she opened her eyes and the masked visage of one Uzumaki Naruto registered in her mind, looking down at her with those deep blue eyes that seemed to reflect the world in them. Desperation was the first emotion that came to her, and tears immediately formed in her eyes as realization dawned on her. No, she whispered hoarsely. Her sobs of misery, sadness, and anger came forth and echoed through the small hut. She moved at speeds that surprised the blonde, not expecting her to have such ability in her weakened state. She tackled him to the ground, her fists weakly beating against his chest. Why? She sobbed. Why? Why couldn't you grant me this? Her tears and cries tore into him. He knew this feeling. This anger. He had felt it, if only for the briefest of moments, towards Sakura. Why did she ask him to continue? To live on. And now this same feeling was being directed at him. He didn't say anything, merely wrapped his arms around her in a comforting embrace. She resisted, if only slightly, before she finally broke, crying and sobbing against him. Her tears soaking the front of his armor. He sighed. In truth, even he himself wondered if saving her had been a cruel kindness. But still, even if this did sound cold, there was more than her emotions at stake. Her life was an important instrument that kept the Inu group together. Even though some part of him said that he was cursing her with pain, the other argued that it was necessary. He slowly raised himself up, bringing her with him. He pulled back so he could face her. Her soft brown eyes almost begging for an explanation. He looked down, averting his eyes. Sango, he began. I know that nothing I can say or do will take the pain away, but I will say this. Will killing yourself bring Kohaku back? She sobbed, her form shaking. It hurt so much. I just wanted to go away. She said. It was almost as if she had become a child again, no longer the proud, stubborn demon slayer that would stand against the tides of Naraku's evil. Just a human being, whose grief and pain had overcome her. He ran a hand through her hair. I know, Sango, I know, but are you truly willing to let your family go unavenged? Will you let Naraku claim victory today? He said softly, and saw some of the former spark return to her eyes. She looked away, tears still came, but the sobs had ceased. I have nothing left now. Kohaku's dead. He was my reason, he was why I kept going. Naruto felt a stab of anger, something he had not felt for quite a long time. He grabbed her by her shoulders, and with one movement that seemed unaffected by her weight, he stood, raising her up with him. She was startled. She shifted her eyes to meet his and froze. The once calm blue was now a pit of cold ice. You still have your friends, don't you? Or don't they count? Have you been traveling with dolls? Because I see human beings that consider you family, who wish to be your family. Obviously you don't feel the same. Her fear abated and her temper flared. She pushed him back with surprising force, placing a hand against the wall to steady her weakened body. What would you know about it? She asked harshly. You stand there preaching to me as if you're God. As if my pain is insignificant. As if I should simply get over it. What the hell do you know about being the last of your family, of watching them all die before your eyes? What the hell makes you think you have any right to lecture me? She yelled at him, her bangs going in front of her face as tears returned again. She glared at him, her breaths coming in heaves as her anger came through. His next action though made her all the more infuriated. He smiled. The bastard was smiling. She wanted to just go over and punch him square in the face. Just to knock that smile off his face. His next words however stopped her dead. Because Sango, everyone I ever loved, is already dead. He whispered before turning to walk out. He stopped just before he exited and tossed a kunai at her feet. I won't force you, Sango. But I think that, maybe your family would want you to live your life even if it hurts to do so. With those words, he left, not once looking back. Several hours later Naruto found himself sitting on the roof of one of the huts as the sun went down. Sango had remained inside, alone for the entire day. He still did not detect the scent of blood, so she had not yet committed the act. Most likely she was thinking of her life and everything that had led to this. Reviewing her emotions. That confrontation had opened sealed wounds. He sighed things would be so much easier if. His thoughts were interrupted at the sound of footsteps. He turned and saw Sango walk out of the hut. She looked up to him, sitting on the roof. They locked gazes for a long while as if reading each other. She raised her hand and threw the kunai. Naruto caught it. Just tell me one thing, she said. Does it ever go away? He stared at her long and hard and she returned his gaze without faltering. After several minutes he spoke. Perhaps. She cast her gaze downward and walked back inside. Naruto sighed. They had been held up for 3 days, no doubt the group was on their way. Hopefully by then Sango would have returned to her normal state of mind. Because after they regrouped, they were going after Naraku. Chapter 22, a reintroduction. The sky was bathed in a dark, deep purple. It had slowly changed from clear blue of spring and was now this dark abyss of miasma and death that seemed to permeate the land. Naraku was gathering his strength for the coming confrontation, Naruto realized. He always did before any major confrontation, but this was different. This time the very air seemed to ooze miasma. Naraku, it appeared, was going to take this fight quite seriously, the blonde shinobi noted as he absently flexed his hand as he stared at the dark castle that was just at the edges of his sharp sight. Perhaps this will be it, he mused. He turned as he heard footsteps coming from behind him and found Kagura shifting from foot to foot rather nervously. Her eyes fixed on the dark lair in the distance. The food is cooked, she mumbled as she diverted her gaze. Naruto nodded and turned back to peer off in thought. The winged demoness, despite the fact that she now had a proper weapon, was still dead nervous about facing her previous enslaver in battle, not entirely unexpected really. Thanks, but I'm not hungry right now, tell the others I'll stay here for a while. She nodded and turned to walk away again. Perhaps this time, he repeated quietly in his mind as he heard the heavens rumble with thunder. Sango watched the dancing fire as it cackled merrily in the center of the camp. Even in the midst of the great darkness they were near. Her mind was clouded, the pain of Kohaku's passing and the pain that came with the fact that she was now truly the last demon slayer were reduced to a dull ache in her chest. The others of the group had noticed her somber and reserved demeanor and had questioned her and Naruto on what had happened. Naruto had looked at her with those icy blues that seemed to show some form of reflection in them. He simply shook his head and spoke. It is not my choice to tell you. He had turned to look at her. It is hers, they had asked her. After a few minutes of questions she had revealed that Naraku had killed Kohaku in front of her. It wasn't the whole truth, but it had satisfied them. Kagome, Shippu and Miroku had hugged her, the last not adding his patented grope. Inuyasha and even Kagura had shown some forms of compassion towards her. The former with a few soft-spoken words that basically translated into a "sorry for your loss," and the latter through some discreet glances with a hint of compassion in them. She had tried to hide them, but Sango, even in her lethargic state of mind, had seen them. Her anger at the demoness had not vanished, but it had dimmed somewhat. She had remembered Naruto's voice those nights ago when he had said, "If you wish to hate Sango, then hate, but do it for a proper reason. Do not hate one for crimes he or she did not commit. It just ends up being more painful for the both of them if that's the case." Those words, back then, had been just that, mere words, offered by someone who claimed to understand her pain when in reality they knew nothing. But now, when she could compare it to what he had told her in that moment of weakness back in her hut in her village, she knew he was speaking from experience, just like then. Because everyone I've ever loved is already dead. Those words, along with the silent tears that trailed down his cheeks, spoke volumes in their own right. She did not know what to think about the blonde shinobi now. He was an enigma with more layers than any person she had ever met, even Inuyasha. A tap on her shoulder brought her out of her thoughts. She turned and found Kagome smiling softly at her. She smiled back, though Annie could tell it was rather subdued. "Hey Sango." The young girl greeted as she sat next to her. "You feeling okay?" Sango nodded and sighed sadly before looking up at the blackened sky. She could see no stars. Naraku's dark evil taint of miasma had even blocked out the heavens. "Kagome," she began softly before turning to the younger girl with pleading eyes. "Please promise that you'll never leave me." Kagome wrapped the girl in a comforting embrace. "Of course Sango, I promise," she whispered. Sango hugged back. "Everyone I've ever loved is already dead." Naruto's sad heart-wrenching words echoed in her mind, making her tighten her grip around Kagome by just a bit. "Please," she begged to any willing to listen. "I don't want that for any of us." Miroku, who watched the scene from a few yards away as he wrote his seals for the upcoming battle, heard the barely restrained desperation in her voice as she made that plea, and somehow, just knew, that for some reason, or some strange circumstance, that their blonde teammate was part of that. How though, that was a question he deemed far too troublesome to answer. Inuyasha grunted the next morning as the group very slowly, in his personal opinion, finished their preparations for battle. Miroku stood as he finished his prayers while Kagome tested the tightness of her bowstring. Sango poured water over her blade and cleaned it, while Kagura and Shippu gave their respective weapons a few test swings, the latter doing it while jumping from tree to tree. "Cage, finally!" Inuyasha grunted. "Are you guys finally ready?" Even though he tried to hide it, anyone with eyes could see he was anxious. He looked around with his patented scowl. "And where is that blonde bast?" "I'm right here, Inuyasha," the blonde said as he emerged from the shadows of the forest, his walk slow and casual, giving off his usual lazy countenance. But they could tell that something had changed in his demeanor. He looked at all of them and smirked, but something was different about this one as well. "Well then," he drawled, "I assume it's time." The battle fought to reach the walls of Naraku's fortress was not an easy one. As the gates came within view, swarms of low-level yokai descended from the heavens, over the walls and from around the sides of the fortress. Naruto, Kagome, Inuyasha and Kagura were the hardest hitters. Naruto using his shadow clones, creating one for each that was destroyed, using his speed and array of kunai and techniques to keep the foes that came from the left at bay, while Miroku, Sango, Kirara and Shippu demolished those on the right. Kagura had taken to the skies, keeping the foes from circling around from above or diving down for a headlong assault. Kagome and Inuyasha took on the center column. The futuristic Miko's arrows tore through the incoming hordes, purifying as many as 7 to 12 of them in a single shot, while Inuyasha used the Tetsusaiga, his wind scar and the Iron Reaver to cut them down. As the yokai began to see that no matter how many they attacked with, the group of warriors would hold their ground, they began to falter and even disperse, when Naraku's twisted power urged them forward, if nothing more than to simply tire the group out. The ground grew slick with the blood and fleshy organs as the demons were cut down. Over and over again they fell. The carnage of battle and the cries of his allies as they swung their weapons brought back memories to the young Uzumaki, visions of the final confrontation between Oto, Konoha and Akatsuki. He struggled to suppress the memories, but they came unbidden. His eyes clouded over as he heard the sickening slice as a kunai cut open the belly of a snake yokai. He remembered when he saw Jiraiya, his sensei and one of the first to acknowledge him as a student worthy of training, fell to the power of the Amaterasu, nothing more than stray ashes in the wind, even as the demonic black fire burned for 7 days and 7 nights. He shifted his position back to avoid one of the yokai that tried to clamp down its powerful jaws along his shoulder. With a wind-lengthened kunai he sliced off the demon's head off, watching as blood came from the wound, sprinkling his face and clothes in the warm crimson liquid. He remembered, as he saw Gaara, the one person he could identify with on the most basic of levels, fall due to exhaustion and the terrible wounds inflicted on him by Deidara. He leapt back and tossed a kunai, his hands going through the motions. His mind was elsewhere though, not in this bloody battlefield but in another. One that was far more terrible to him than 1,000 battles would be able to accomplish together. He remembered as Tsunade, someone he had grown to love, perhaps as far as to call her the mother he had never had, fell to a savage kunai slash across her abdomen, too delirious and too weary from battle and blood loss to mold or even have the amount of chakra necessary to heal the grievous wound. Her pale blonde locks framing her face, she looked so peaceful, even in death. His clouded, dull eyes raised and saw more yokai, hundreds of them, approaching him. Their bloodlust and mindless madness that glinted in their demonic eyes was almost tangible. He smiled an eerie smile, one that had never adorned his face, or perhaps it had, merely hidden amongst the shadows of his mask. He continued to smile, even as he took his fighting stance. His smile remained even as the yokai approached, and continued to remain, even as he could feel air waves of bloodlust washed over him, even as scenes of bloody battles and former friends came to him, and it remained even as tears came and fell, their soft pitter-patter on the blood-soaked ground going unheard throughout the chaos. "Is everyone all right?" Kagome called as Inuyasha cut down the last demon. Another, barely alive, tried to sneak up behind her, but an orange blur crossed its path before a sickening slice was head and its head rolled. Kagome turned around and saw Shippu, with a few specks of blood on him. It was strange seeing him like that. His childlike innocence always seemed to make imagining him killing so impossible, but Kagome had to remind herself that despite how much she loved him, he was still a demon. It was almost second nature really. Even for humans, killing was a baser instinct. With demons it was just more pronounced. She turned and found Sango swiping her sword to get rid of the blood as she placed Hirikatsu on her back, while Miroku put more sutra on his staff. Kagura drifted down from the sky and her feather returned to its usual place on her hairpiece. Kagome turned and saw Inuyasha deliver a final wind scar, eliminating the last chunk of the horde, scattering their ashes. She turned to where Naruto had been fighting and immediately had to stifle a gasp. It wasn't because of some terrible injury, or that a yokai was approaching for a surprise attack. No, it was just his eyes. Those eyes, once a vibrant amused blue, now dull, lifeless cold empty voids scanned over the scene of blood and death. His once vibrant blonde hair was now almost brown and lay matted against his forehead, drenched in blood and covered with dirt and mud. The crimson-red liquid trailed down his face, his blue eyes shined in the dim light much like a dog at night. The miasma that blanketed the sky like a dark plague gave way to reveal the blood-red moon that hung directly overhead. The blonde turned, and in that instant, he was the most terrifying yet saddest creature she had ever seen. He averted his gaze and stared up at the walls of the fortress before he, with a single leap, leapt over the fortress wall, leaving the others behind. "Naruto!" She yelled, startled. The others turned and just managed to catch a glimpse of the blonde before he vanished behind the wall. "Crazy bastard!" Inuyasha snarled as he rushed to catch up. The ground beneath their feet shook violently and Naraku's chilling laughter floated to them. "Fools!" He chuckled amusedly. "Time to kill you." Before anyone could do much, a large explosion came from within the walls of the castle and a massive spider, almost 100 feet high, rose, screeching a battle cry as it sent one of its 16 feet toward the Inu group. Naraku is a spider demon, and so I figured this was fitting, and I gave him twice as many legs as a normal spider. I did it on purpose, not by mistake. Inuyasha rushed and lifted Kagome as Shippu jumped on her shoulder, and with a leap they were able to escape the demon's attack. Kagura used her feather and took Miroku as she sailed back, while Sango leapt on Kirara to escape. The Inu Taichi locked upon Naraku's true form and couldn't help but feel fear. Not even Sesshomaru was this big in his true form. This would be tough. Kukios no Jutsu. They heard before a massive cloud of smoke appeared behind the spider demon. They each turned and found a bright orange toad, with two blades strapped across his back and a blue gi along with a pipe in his mouth, staring at the massive spider demon with complete and utter shock. Naruto looked at the toad and immediately, a true smile, one he had not shown since that day, appeared on his face as recognition entered his eyes. "Gamakichi," he said, smiling down at the massive toad. The toad rolled his eyes upwards and immediately felt them go wider than normal. Bro? What the hell?" The toad yelled before he moved his tongue so he could grab the blonde and place him on his webbed hand. He took a massive breath before he yelled at him with gale-forced winds producing from his mouth. 4,500 years. 4,500 years, you bastard! I thought you were killed along with Jiraiya. What the fuck is wrong with you? Where the hell have you been, and why are you summoning me now? He paused. And how the hell are you summoning me anyway? Humans don't live 4,500 years. Where the hell have you been? The toad looked up and leapt back to avoid a swipe from one of the massive spider's razor-sharp legs. Naruto clung to the toad with chakra and spoke. "I will explain everything later, Gamakichi, I swear, but help me beat this guy now." The toad narrowed its eyes and then slowly nodded. "Fine." He conceded before placing the blonde back on his head and took out both his katana. Naruto stood proudly on his old friend's head, crossing his arms and glaring up at the slightly taller spider demon. "Now then, let's reintroduce this world to a summon battle." Chapter 23, Out for Blood. Naruto looked upon the massive spider yokai with apathy. even as its massive legs uprooted trees and kicked up dust as it positioned itself to face him and Gamakichi. He felt no fear, no excitement, no anxiety, nothing. He felt pleasantly numb. He looked down at Gamakichi's serious expression. "I assume you know all of your old man's techniques?" he said, making the large toad nod, the action causing a slight feeling of vertigo go through him as the comparatively small movement made him feel like he was on a roller coaster. He nodded. "Good. Then let's show this bastard what we're made of." Gamakichi took a puff from his pipe and unsheathed the two katanas on his back. "Been way too long since I've fought a real battle. After all, since the ninja world fell in the Bijou Wars, we haven't had a summoner." Naruto nodded as the spider seemed to laugh strangely before it rushed at them, its four front legs poised as blades ready to stab the boss toad. "Up!" Naruto commanded, and with a leap Gamakichi was practically flying back to avoid the pincer-like leg blades. The toad's stomach seemed to enlarge before his throat swelled and then Suetun, Tepidama. The toad yelled as a massive water ball was launched straight for the spider demon. Naraku, in his hulking form, could not dodge due to his momentum and received the hit full in the face. He screeched horribly, making Naruto's ears ring, and rushed forward again. Meanwhile down below. What the hell? Inuyasha gasped as he saw the two massive forms begin to duke it out. Kagome and the others had similar thoughts running through their minds but could only stare at the sight slack-jawed. Only Kagura seemed to have her wits about her. "Did you all hear what the toad said?" Miroku snapped back to the real world and ran over the previous events that had occurred in the last 5 minutes. "If what the creature said is true, then Naruto's really old Shippu put in helpfully." Inuyasha snorted. "We can beat the crap out of him later and get our answers, but right now we have to fight." Inuyasha," Kakagome chirped. "There's only one little problem with that plan." "What?" he snapped. "He's 100 feet tall. Your wind scar is like an annoying sting to him now." Inuyasha growled, realizing that his wind scar would probably do nothing more than merely scratch the surface. Rokitsusei was testament to that. Kagura snorted and took out her 3 feathers, making them grow. "Get on, they'll follow your orders once you're on them," she said, getting onto her feather and leaving the other 2 for Inuyasha and Kagome. The 2 looked hesitant, but a fierce screech from the spider Hanyu had them up on top of their respective feathers. Shippu, feeling more secure with Kagome, leapt onto hers as well. Sango and Miroku mounted Kirara, and together the group took to the sky. Gamakichi crisscrossed his swords to block as Naraku's 4 front legs came at him, the tough exoskeleton standing up well to the razor-sharp katanas. Naruto saw an opportunity as the blades met the attack. "Oil now." Gamakichi complied, spitting out a huge stream of oil that covered Naraku's spider-like face and his upper body. "Katan, Gameu Enden. Toad oil flame bullet." Naraku screeched and lashed out in pain as his face and upper body were instantly lit. The bright flames were so hot even the Inu group, which were still a little ways away, could feel it. In a rage, Naraku lashed out with his 5th leg, catching Gamakichi off guard. The boss toad couldn't react in time and received a jagged gash along his side. The toad leapt back and cursed as he clutched his bleeding side. "Damn it, bro, I swear if we get out of this I'll kill you myself," he grunted. Naruto chuckled before turning serious again as the oil burnt out and the flames began to die down. Naraku's exoskeleton was slightly cracked in a few places due to the great heat, but otherwise, no extra damage had been done. "Got any suggestions?" the blonde asked his old friend. Gamakichi grunted. "Don't look at me, my clan never really had any confrontations with the Spider Clan." "The snakes did though." Naruto sighed but then felt his eyes go wide as Naraku's mouth opened and a massive ball of concentrated miasma began forming there. Naruto and Gamakichi were suddenly having flashbacks from the fight with Shikaku. Gamakichi was little back then, but he was still there. He was on Naruto's head. "Hold on!" Gamakichi yells as he leapt straight up just as Naraku released the ball of concentrated miasma. The very earth seemed to corrode and die as the miasma passed over it. Unknown to the two, however, they had just fallen into Naraku's trap. The spider yokai lifted itself and with what appeared to be a deep breath shot out a huge stream of spider webbing, heading straight for the toad and ninja. Gamakichi moved to release a water blast, but both he and Naruto knew it wouldn't be ready in time. "Wind scar!" was heard just before a wave of golden energy obliterated the incoming webbing. Naruto and Gamakichi looked up, and found Inuyasha standing triumphantly over Kagura's feather, with a fairly cocky smirk on his face. Naraku, in a rage, rushed forward and with the 4 front legs that he could spare, began sending a flurry of strikes toward the boss toad. Gamakichi backpedaled as best he could, which looked strange due to the fact that he was a 50-foot toad running, basically moving away from a 100-foot tall spider. Naraku, with a mighty swing of one of his legs, smacked away one of Gamakichi's katana and stabbed the boss toad in the shoulder with another leg while he kept his second sword busy with the other 2. Gamakichi cursed as Naraku raised his one free offensive leg and prepared to stab the boss toad in the head. Before he could bring it down, however, his leg was suddenly turned to ash as Kagome's purifying arrow hit it dead center. The spider demon reeled back in shock and pain even as his lost limb regenerated. It roared as it heaved Gamakichi up by its wounded shoulder and tossed him aside, roughly 200 yards. It then rounded off to face the Inu group. It screeched once before spitting out clumps of miasma in their direction, while simultaneously putting a mist of the poisonous vapors that slowly spread outwards. Soon they wouldn't even be able to get close enough to attack. Kagura, Kagome, Inuyasha and Sango each entered a form of dogfight, dodging Naraku's acidic spit while simultaneously launching strikes of their own as they tried to find some form of weak spot on the spider demon's outer skin. Gamakichi groaned as he picked himself up. "Oh yeah, if this bastard doesn't kill you, I sure as hell will, Uzumaki," the toad said as he clutched his second wound and leaned on his blade. Naruto grunted. He had managed to stay on the boss's head with chakra, but that didn't help his stomach at all. He really wanted to throw up right now. He looked back up toward Naraku as the Inu group kept attacking him. "I think I might have a jutsu that can win this," he said. Gamakichi glared up at him. "And we didn't try this sooner because?" he inquired in a tone that promised death. Naruto smiled. "I kinda forgot about it. If looks could kill, Naruto would have had a hole in his head." The blonde turned serious. "But the only way it's gonna work is if you make a hole in his outer skin, at least the size of my fist. I can only do this jutsu at maximum capacity once and at most, twice. I think I can make the hole, but you have to hold him down." Gamakichi nodded seriously. And with a mighty leap, soared into the air. Naruto was surprised by the unexpected move and had to crouch so as not to fall off. "What the hell are you doing?" Gamakichi sucked in a deep breath of air and somehow managed to shift himself so his back was facing the earth. Then just as they were passing directly over Naraku, the toad let all of the air in his gut out like a great jet of air that propelled him downwards. "Bug-crushing jutsu!" the toad yelled just before he crashed right over Naraku in what was considered a gigantic body slam. Naraku felt all the air leave his body. Despite the fact that he was taller than Gamakichi, the toad weighed much more. He tried to lift himself using his 16 legs, but it proved to be with difficult, especially with the fact that Gamakichi had grabbed 4 of them on his left side and was trying to cut off the others with his sword on his right side. The Inu group, who had been blown back by the shockwave, could only stare at one of the strangest, most ridiculous sights they had ever seen. They soon snapped out of it, however, and charged in, coming in with renewed vigor. Naruto meanwhile had lost his grip on Gamakichi and was now lying on Naraku's thrashing back. "Oh shit, his head hurt. Did anyone get the license plate of that truck?" He stood up on wobbly legs and took in his surroundings. As soon as he noticed Gamakichi's trashing form and felt movement beneath his feet, he knew he was on Naraku's body. He flexed his right hand and in seconds a bright ball of energy was formed. "Let's see your armor stand up to this," he said in a low, dangerous tone before he raised his hand up. "Rasengan!" he yelled as he slammed his hand down. Several loud cracks and crunches were heard as the ground gave way beneath him. He leapt back and found that his Rasengan had torn open a hole the size of a shopping cart. He flexed his shoulder. "Well, that'll do," he muttered before he formed 2 clones and each cupped their hands together. "Wind Scar! Fuji no Mai! Hirekatsu!" came 3 simultaneous yells as they attacked Naraku. Sango's boomerang cutting off one of Naraku's hind legs, hitting the only exposed flesh, which was where the leg met the body. While Kagura's attack sent dozens of her wind blades that sliced into Naraku's face, one even managing to cut off a mandible. She smirked at his screech of pain, while the big toad on his back cursed as he was now struggling even more to get free. The group paused as they saw a bright blue light. They each looked a little closer and managed to see that it was coming from their blonde-haired companion before he slammed it into Naraku. They each heard and felt the resounding boom and watched as Naraku's trashing increased to an almost desperate state. Then they saw a second light, but this one felt even more powerful. Naruto grunted as his most powerful technique formed in his hands. The Kaze Raisen Shuriken. "I'm pretty sure this is the name of the technique," His eyes narrowed as he stared at Naraku's exposed flesh beneath the exoskeleton. "Time to die," he said coldly before raising his arm up. "Kaze Raisin Shuriken." He yells before slamming the ball of destruction down into the demon's back. He can feel flesh tearing, blending, and twisting beneath his hand. The jutsu plows on through. He pours his chakra, his emotions, all the sadness, the anger and pain bottled up in his chest, hidden deep in his worn and wounded heart. His face, though, even as he feels all of these emotions, and never wavers from its apathetic cold gaze, even as he feels the bones in his arms snapping from the strain. Finally, with a cry of pain and a massive explosion, all is silent. The Inu group, who had retreated when they felt the massive power, had watched the spectacle from above. The toad was nowhere to be seen and only chunks of Naraku's body remained. But where was Naruto? Physical pain was not new to the young Uzumaki. He had felt it, possibly more than most, during his relatively short lifetime. And right now he was one of the extreme cases of physical pain he had ever experienced. His entire right arm, from his wrist all the way up to his shoulder, was completely and totally shattered. The improved version of the Rasengan he had created with Kakashi and Yamato-sensei was powerful, but damaged him as well. This would not really be a problem, since basically anyone short of a six-tailed demon would probably be quite out of commission for a great length of time should they suffer a direct hit from that attack. But the simple fact that he had used the technique, therefore snapping his forearm in 3 places, and then also been caught in the explosion that had sent him flying, and then after that crashing through several trees as a landing, really wasn't helping things. The fall had broken the rest of the bones in his arm as well as one rib. So yes, he could safely say he was in pain. His right arm was bleeding horribly, his forehead protector was practically nothing but a slab of metal with a string attached to it, his clothes also had tears and burn marks in several places. Overall, he looked like he had been through World War II, with a bright bullseye on his uniform that said, "Hit me, I'm open." So it was no surprise that when one of the group finally caught sight of him, the first thing to leave the person's mouth was a nice "Holy shit." Yup, definitely helping his self-confidence there. He looked up through weary eyes and caught sight of Kagura signaling the others. She walked over and knelt beside him. "You look like shit," she said after a few seconds of silence. "Thank you," he chirped, smiling at her just as the rest of the group arrived. Kagome and Sango rushed over to see if he had any life-threatening injuries as Kagura stood. "I'll be fine," he grunted. "It'll just take about a week or so to properly heal if I don't move it." Kagome narrowed her eyes at him. "A week?" she questioned. "You'll be lucky if you ever use this arm again, Naruto." He chuckled. Her fussing reminded him of when he had first used the technique. Sakura had been on his case for a whole month after that. His eyes clouded over and he let out a sigh. "Sakura." His reminiscing was cut off, however, as a dark chuckle echoed from the forest. The entire group immediately stood up on alert. That laugh, they could never mistake it. Purple miasma formed itself just at the edge of the clearing and Naraku's battered and beaten form revealed itself. In reality, all he was an upper torso. From his left shoulder down to the right side of his waist, his body was completely blown off and the upper part of his body was beaten to a pulp. Massive gashes and huge bruises could be seen everywhere. "Fools." He laughed darkly. "Did you think you could possibly defeat me?" Inuyasha snarled and unsheathed Tetsusaiga. The Fong pulsed with power as the enraged Hanyu glared at the parasite. Naraku chuckled. "You have beaten me here. So I have decided to leave you with a parting gift." Naruto stood on shaky legs. He really didn't like where this was going. Naraku smirked and lifted his last remaining hand to show 3 corrupted jewel shards. "My gift," he practically hissed before the 3 shards shot forward at speeds even Naruto could barely catch. No one had time to react, as the 3 shards stabbed themselves into Inuyasha's throat. The entire group snapped their attention to him as he dropped Tetsusaiga in surprise and clutched his neck, as if being choked by some unseen foe. "Have fun." Naraku laughed mirthlessly. "Inuyasha!" Kagome cried as she rushed towards him. A flash of red in the Hanyo's eyes warned Naruto and he shot forward, using his one good arm to grab Kagome from behind and pull her back. "Stop! He's not himself!" The blonde yelled as the others were about to move forward as well. Everyone paused as Inuyasha's breathing went back to normal and he slowly stood. His face and eyes were hidden from view due to his silver hair. The group looked on warily. When Inuyasha finally turned to face them, they knew he was not himself. His once golden eyes were now bloodshot red and magenta stripes adorned his cheeks, only these were much more jagged and thick in comparison to Sesshomaru's stripes. Inuyasha had been consumed by his demonic blood, and the look in his eyes said he was out for blood. Chapter 24, The Demon Emerges. The air was thick with tension. The entire group stared at the red-clad Hanyu with trepidation. As a low chuckle came from him, they all tensed. Naruto's eyes narrowed as his laughter became one of insane glee. This was most definitely not the Inuyasha they knew. His red eyes shined in the dim moonlight, his laughter ceased and snarls took its place. He flashed a fanged grin which spoke of bloodlust and insanity before he raised his claws. "Run!" The blonde shouted as he rushed forward and snaked his left arm around Kagome's waist. Just as Shippo managed to jump on her shoulder, he took off with Sango and Miroku mounting Kirara and Kagura leaving on her feather. Inuyasha snarled and with a cry of rage he rushed after the blonde ninja. Kagome, who had lost her senses for a moment from the sudden, rapid movement, a feeling of vertigo as they rushed through the trees, finally managed to regain herself and looked to Naruto, who had a few beads of sweat running down his forehead. She looked behind her just in time to see Inuyasha take a lunge at them. His half-demon speed was impressive on its own, but as a full demon and now one with the added power of 3 jewel shards, it was more than enough to surpass Naruto's already impressive speed. As his claws reared back, ready to swing, Kagome only had one thing return to the forefront of her mind. "Sit!" The beads around Inuyasha's neck glowed brightly and with startled eyes the Hanyu plunged to the forest floor. Unlike last time, however, he did not hit face first, instead his hands and knees slammed into the earth as he tried to keep himself upwards. Naruto glanced back at Inuyasha and saw as he hit the forest floor. "Keep activating the prayer beads," he ordered. Kagome nodded and continued to yell out the command word, over and over again, keeping the enraged Inu subjugated. After what seemed like eternity, which was really only a few minutes of Kagome shouting herself hoarse, the three stopped in a clearing. As Naruto set them down, he leaned tiredly against the tree. The pain of his arm was almost unbearable, sweat marred his forehead, God, everything in his arm was just throbbing. "Naruto!" Kagome called worriedly as she moved to him and wrapped an arm around his waist to keep him standing. Shippo looked worriedly at his sensei/companion/friend. His arm really did look bad and the stench of blood coming off him was very strong, indicating that it was bleeding a lot. Naruto breathed heavily but still managed to smile at the two. "I'm fine, I've seen worse." He breathed out before straightening himself and looking at their two worried expressions. Sango, Miroku and Kirara swooped down along with Kagura, all looking relatively uneasy with the situation. Naruto looked at all of them. "We need to stop him, anyone got any ideas?" Miroku was the first to speak. "I've designed some new seals from the ones you've shown me that can suppress demonic energy. I'm not sure if they'll work, but..." He trailed off at the end. Naruto nodded. "Give them to me, I have a better chance of slapping them on and escaping unharmed than what you have." Miroku nodded and began shifting through his equipment, searching for the experimental seals. Kagome spoke next. "The Tetsuzaiga was always a suppressant to his demonic blood. If he has it in his hand or somewhere on his person, his demon blood will be suppressed again." Naruto nodded, he knew that from having watched their adventures. Kagura spoke up. "You're forgetting the shards. Those things are corrupted and Naraku most likely placed them so that even with the Tetsuzaiga's suppressive seals his demonic blood wouldn't be sealed," she said, cursing the parasitic Hanyu again. The entire group fell silent until Shippo spoke up. "Then we have to remove the shards. It's not that easy." Naruto spoke. "Naraku placed those shards along his neck, near the jugular vein. I highly doubt Inuyasha will stay still long enough for us to surgically remove the shards so we don't hit his jugular." The night seemed to grow bleaker by the second, and it wasn't helping that the sounds of a snarling angry Hanyu was approaching them. Sango spoke up. "Then what do we do?" Naruto spoke up again. "There are only two things we can do, and one is very difficult, while the other one most, if not none of you are going to like. We either knock him unconscious or we kill him." The temperature seemed to have dropped several degrees. The Inu group seemed horrified at the second idea. Only Kagura's expression was lined with apathy. "Then I suppose we knock him unconscious," Naruto said. He turned to Shippo, Kirara and Miroku as the monk handed him the special seals. "You three go back and get the Tetsuzaiga. Since we don't want to kill him, then your wind tunnel is of no use here, Miroku." The monk nodded in understanding before getting up on Kirara, with Shippo jumping and landing on the enlarged Nico Yokai's head. With a swift movement they took to the sky, giving Inuyasha a wide berth. Naruto then turned to Kagura and the other females. Kagura, give them your feathers, I'll distract him and you three get in as many shots as you can whenever you know you won't hit me. Kagura nodded grimly, while the other two looked downright stricken. Kagome especially. Kagura formed her 3 feathers and the 3 females took to the sky. Naruto watched them rise just before Inuyasha burst through the tree line, his claws reared back ready to strike. He turned around and managed to dodge the attack by sidestepping and slapped one of the 5 seals Miroku had given him onto Inuyasha's outstretched arm. The seal glowed red and hissed as it was burnt onto his skin, making it impossible to remove. Inuyasha growled deep in his throat and delivered a savage backhand to the blonde's face, which sent him flying back, crashing into a tree. Naruto straightened, his weakened state was in reality no match for the Hanyo's increased strength. Blood loss and pain were starting to take its toll on him. He looked up, his vision slightly blurry. Instinct and reflexes are what saved him as he leaned to the side and caught Inuyasha's wrist as the Hanyu tried to strike him again. Even so, Inuyasha's claws bit deep into his left collarbone, blood flowed freely from the new injuries. He gritted his teeth in pain as he tried to push the Hanyu back, but the fact that he was using his offhand added to the Inu demon's enhanced strength only made it so he was only able from preventing him from digging his claws in further. Fuji no Mai. They heard. Inuyasha growled and halfway turned to face the wind blades and used his free arm to release an iron reaver to counter. The 2 attacks cancelled each other out. Kagura's eyes widened in surprise. Inuyasha's attack had never been able to counter hers so easily. This was just proof that he was now immensely more powerful. Hirekatsu. They heard, but this time Inuyasha couldn't turn in time to face the attack and received the hit right along his lower back, which threw him into the forest, crashing headfirst into a tree with a sickening crack. Naruto straightened himself and awkwardly held his bleeding left collarbone with his left hand. He couldn't even make hand seals for any jutsu with his right arm in such bad conditions, which left him with a limited arsenal. All he had was the Rasengan, a potentially lethal technique. He wasn't sure if even with this amount of power if Inuyasha could handle having his insides twisted and some may even be shredded. He couldn't contemplate his thoughts further as Inuyasha burst through the tree line again, this time setting his sights on the 2 females that attacked him. Naruto barely registered as the silver-haired Hanyu jumped to a tree branch and catapulted towards them. He reared his claws back and launched 2 iron reavers towards the slightly startled females. Sango caught her Hirekatsu and moved to use it as a shield while Kagura prepared to swing her fan. As the attacks approached, a pearlescent light shot through the night air cancelling both attacks. All eyes turned to Kagome, who had notched another bow into her arrow and was ready to let it loose towards Inuyasha. The out-of-control Inu growled and snarled as he saw her interfere. Before he could attack her, however, our favorite blonde ninja appeared slightly above him. Inuyasha looked up and Naruto immediately slapped a seal on his forehead. The seal burnt into his skin, leaving Inuyasha snarling in pain and in range. Before he could, however, Naruto delivered a solid knee to his chin with enough force to make him backflip twice as he fell towards earth. Inuyasha landed on his hands and knees and moved to stand up again. As he got to his feet, Naruto came down with a crushing axe kick down onto his collarbone. A sickening crunch resounded through the air as Inuyasha's bones broke under the strain. The Hanyu nearly fell to the ground but caught his footing at the last minute and came back with a vicious slash in an uppercut motion. Naruto managed to backpedal enough to avoid a swipe to the face but still received 3 nasty gashes along his chest. The injuries bled freely. Naruto clutched his chest in pain and wobbled on his feet. Now he really was gonna pass out. Inuyasha moved forward again with the full intent of eliminating the blonde nuisance. The sounds of the broken bones Naruto had managed to give him snapping back into place and mending at rapid speeds echoed from the trees. Once again, however, he was met by interference. Inuyasha, stop! Kagome yelled before firing an arrow at him. The arrow hit him in the right shoulder. He looked up, eyes alight with fury, but he did not see Kagome. No, he saw the same woman who had imprisoned him so many years ago, the woman he once loved, Kikyo. While his human side still loved her, his demonic side could not stomach the thought of her betrayal. He snarled and removed the arrow from where it had been stabbed into his shoulder and rushed to her. Kikyo! He yelled in a rage. Naruto, never one to miss an opportunity, pushed chakra into his legs and slapped another seal onto his back. Inuyasha paid him no heed, however, as he merely continued to rush towards Kagome, with the full intent of harm. Kagome's eyes lit up with righteous fury and indignation. Too many times she had endured him confusing her with her dead incarnation and she was sick of it. Her power, fueled by her anger, surged forth and shined brightly on the tip of her arrow. She let it fly, hitting the Hanyu again in his right shoulder. The jewel shards pulsed as the purifying wave hit them. Their corrupt power weakened by the wave of purification. Inuyasha staggered back in a daze. Naruto seized the opportunity to slap the last two seals on him. They burnt into his skin through the fire rat robe. Inuyasha clutched his head in pain and fell to his knees. Naruto, his vision blurry from blood loss, could hear his own blood pumping through his veins as the adrenaline died down. But even so, he could tell they were not out of danger yet. Inuyasha's eyes continued to shift from gold to red, indicating that the seals were suppressing the beast, but the power of the corrupt jewel shards remained. Naruto! The blonde lethargically turned his head and saw Miroku on Kirara's back clutching an untransformed Tetsusaiga. The monk threw it down to him. Naruto lazily raised his hand and caught the hilt of the blade with practiced ease. This, however, proved to be a fatal mistake. Inuyasha, having heard the voice and the familiar sound of a weapon, looked up at Naruto, who had just caught his sword and was now holding it in a way that made it seem as if he was about to behead him. Still struggling with his instincts and not quite down from battle high, his survival nature took over and he did the first thing he could think of. He attacked. Naruto saw Inuyasha's features shift into a feral snarl and his eyes flash a dangerous red. His eyes widened, but before he could pull back, Inuyasha rushed forward, grabbed the wrist that held the blade, and to everyone's shock and horror, he reared back his claws and punched them through the blonde's chest, his fist coming out the other side. Still going on his survival instinct, Inuyasha then gripped the sword in Naruto's hand in order to throw it to the side so he could disarm him. But as his clawed hand wrapped around the blade, Tetsusaiga pulsed and the world suddenly became startlingly clear to him. He wished it hadn't. He didn't know why, he didn't know how, he couldn't remember what had happened. It was all just a haze. The others all stared in horror at the sight. Sango, Kagome and Shippu felt tears beginning to form. Kagura and Miroku could only stare with looks of horror etched on their faces. A myriad of emotions passed through everyone. Fear, disbelief, anger, pain, sadness, too many to name really. They felt it, they saw it, but they couldn't believe it. He had always seemed so invincible. Like an insurmountable tower, from which they all drew inspiration, strength, wisdom. Hell, everything. He was like a beacon of light in a world that had seemed so bleak that hope had become a thing of dreams. The world seemed so much darker now. Naruto felt all the strength leave his legs and he had to grasp Inuyasha's fire rat robe to help steady himself. He coughed up blood, which stained his face mask and dripped down his chin. The edges of his vision were going dark. His heartbeat, he could hear it. It was so faint. Was he dying? Inuyasha was terrified. What had he done? What had happened? Why? He looked to Naruto's half-lidded gaze, but then, the young Umbu did the last thing Inuyasha could have ever expected. He smiled. It wasn't one of his smirks he gave when he was about to give a wise-ass comments, it wasn't one of his lazy bored smiles, it wasn't even one of the ones he gave when he knew something you didn't. It was a smile, where his eyes seemed to shine with some hidden joy. It was what he would call a true smile. Naruto chuckled weakly. Before his eyes closed, his breathing shallowed and his heart stilled. Inuyasha removed his arm with a sickening sound and caught the Umbu as he fell. His mind still reeling from this shock. His mind, it couldn't comprehend it, it couldn't understand what he had done. The others, at the sight of Naruto's limp body finally falling, rushed down and landed near Inuyasha as the Hanyu laid him against the cold wet ground. They each looked down and could only breathe in shock as they found the most peaceful contented smile on the young blonde ninja's masked face. Before they could do anything, however, the sky rumbled and shifted from its eerie black to a bloodshot red. The Inu group looked around worriedly, Miroku taking up a defensive stance with his staff as well as Kagura, Sango, and Kagome. Inuyasha slowly stood, his claws dripping with blood. Naruto's blood. The group each turned as a strange red energy began to form above them. They backed away in fear. This power was oppressive, terrifying even. They watched in fear and dread as the massive form of a burning fox head appeared in midair. The strange creature let out the most terrifying, unearthly roar any one of them have ever heard. They fell to their knees as the creature's power seemed to wash over them, it shook them to the very core. Kagome felt her stomach lurch and with a heave her stomach contents fell over the forest floor. As the creature's roar ended, it seemed to grin before it swirled in a tornado of flames and slammed into the forest floor. Inuyasha managed to regain his wits and grabbed Kagome and Shippu in order to back away from the flames that were approaching them. Wait! Naruto! She yelled in alarm as she saw the flames consume him. Kagura too regained her wits and picked up Miroku before moving back. Kirara picked up Sango and took to the skies. As the tornado of fire died away, the entire group slowly approached and came across an empty field. Naruto Uzumaki had vanished. Chapter 25, Midoriko's Message. It had been 3 days since the fateful battle against Naraku, and the Inu group was in an understandably somber state. Not many words were spoken between them, each of the groups lost in their own thoughts and trying to recover from Naruto's death. Kagome had removed the shards from Inuyasha's neck with her Miko abilities that she had received ironically from the person they were all now mourning. It was just so surreal. They had been talking to him just the other day and then he was just gone. It had all happened so fast. Shippu, Kagome and Sango had cried that day and most of the next. Kagura had become much more reserved and rarely spoke to anyone unless they addressed her first. Miroku, ever the peaceful monk, had been chanting prayers for Naruto almost the entire time. Inuyasha, however, was by far the worst of them. He had barely said 2 words to them during the entire 3 days and had taken up residence in a tree branch. They had tried to get him to come down, but it had been to no avail. Kagome looked into the happily dancing flames with dull eyes. Miroku was meditating against a tree, Sango was half-heartedly sharpening Hireikatsu, Shippu, his eyes puffy from crying, was asleep in her sleeping bag, with Kirara wrapped around him. Kagura was currently resting on a tree branch, with her back against the trunk, and Inuyasha. He was still in the same spot he had been for the last 3 days. With his back to them, his left foot dangled from the tree branch. She sighed and stood, walking over until she was at the base of the tree he was on. "Inuyasha!" She called, hoping he would at least acknowledge her. He did not. She sighed. "Inuyasha, please, come down. It wasn't your fault, let's talk about this." He didn't move. She held back her tears, born from both sadness and frustration, and took a deep breath. She was too tired, physically, mentally and emotionally, to negotiate with him all night. Maybe tomorrow he would be more reasonable. With a small sigh, she turned and walked over to the fire before opening her sleeping bag and crawling in next to Kirara and Shippu. Kagura listened to the girl's breathing as it steadied and evened out, indicating she had fallen asleep. Miroku was in a deep trance-like state, no doubt trying to calm his mind due to the events of the last few days. Sango was also only half aware of her surroundings. She stood and leapt from her branch, landing silently next to Inuyasha and putting a hand on his shoulder, startling him. "You're coming with me," she said in a harsh whisper before she took out her fan, and the two of them vanished in a small tornado that went unnoticed by those in the camp. Meanwhile, Kagome's sleep was not as peaceful as it seemed. Kagome's dreamscape. Kagome groaned as she opened her eyes, only to find herself directly in front of a horde of yokai that were only 3 feet in front of her, their jaws wide open in preparation to devour her. She screamed in reflex and leapt back, her hand reflexively moving towards her bow, only to find the weapon was missing. She began to panic when she noticed that the yokai were moving no further. She looked a little closer and noticed a faint pink barrier holding them back. A barrier? She looked around for a few moments before the faint outline of a woman formed in front of her. She was almost transparent, the upper part of her body was visible while her legs were nearly invisible, only the small fluctuation in the air outlined them. "Even here, with your purity, I am still weak." The strange ghost-like woman spoke. "But it is only natural, my powers cannot last forever." Kagome recovered from her slight shock and spoke, having sensed only the pure aura of a Miko, not the angry one of a demon, or the sorrowful one of a spirit. As she got a closer look, she noticed the telltale diamond mark on her forehead that identified her as the legendary priestess. "Midoriko?" she gasped out. The ancient priestess groaned in pain and clutched her chest, collapsing on her knees as the yokai continued to slam against the barrier. Kagome moved forward and tried to grab her, only to have her hands pass right through her form. "I have little time," she gasped as she panted for breath. "You must find him, help him." "Help who? Who are you talking about?" she called, huddling around the struggling spirit. Her form seemed to fade for a moment before it materialized again. "Naruto," she gasped, further shocking the young girl. "You must find him, and help him. I do not know what intentions the Nine Tails possesses, its power is too great, and I cannot pierce the veil it has placed between Naruto and myself." Kagome tried to grasp what the priestess was telling her, but it was too much, too fast, so she asked the most obvious question. "Naruto's alive?" Midoriko struggled to remain, but her form faded out and her barrier dissipated. Her voice, faint and weak, drifted to Kagome along the passing breeze. "Find him. He suffers, even now. With a bright flash of light, Kagome was thrown from her dreamscape and into the world of the living. Meanwhile, with Kagura and Inuyasha, the dog Hanyu didn't have a chance to regain his bearings as Kagura's small tornado dissipated a few dozen yards away from the camp, well out of earshot, before the wind demoness backhanded him across the face, hard. He stumbled back and glared at her. Bitch, what was that for? He snarled as he placed his hand on Tetsusaiga's hilt. Kagura, graceful as ever, closed her fan, crossed her arms and glared right back. Look, I know what happened is hard for you to swallow, but you've got to get out of this stupid funk you're in. It's making everyone miserable. Inuyasha snarled, fuck off, it's none of your business anyway. Kagura snorted, while still somehow keeping that graceful elegance about her. Yeah right, we're wasting time here. With Naraku weakened, his barriers can't be maintained so well, meaning we'll be able to find that blasted infant and kill it, thus killing Naraku. But with you dragging your feet and moping about, Naraku's going to recover and we'll have to kill him again before we have a shot at the kid. Inuyasha snarled. That's all you cared about, huh? Heartless bitch, Naruto should have let Kuga have his revenge, seeing as you obviously don't give a rat's ass that he's dead. As the words left his mouth, he saw Kagura's eyes darken considerably. Just shut up. She bit out harshly. She looked away, her form tense and rigid. I do care, she said after a moment. I care because he was the only one that cared for me, she whispered as she hung her head. But, she said after a moment, her voice regaining its former strength. Just because he died doesn't mean I can sit around and let what he did all be in vain. If you want to repay him for what you did, then I suggest you get off your ass and do what you have to do. She spoke, staring him dead in the eye, ruby red clashing with amber gold. Before either of them could speak though, a scream came from the camp. Aw! They both turned to the sound of Kagome's voice and rushed back to the camp. Sango absently continued running a stone over her hirekatsu. She had seen it. His smile. She had seen it clear as day and it frightened her. Everyone I've ever loved is already dead. The words continued to eat away at her, again and again. She should have seen it, she should have known that he was suffering. Her pain was similar to his, so why hadn't she done something? He had always helped them, always placed the others before himself. She should have helped him. She should have. She didn't know what she should have done, but she should have done something. Perhaps if she had, he wouldn't have died. He welcomed death. Wanted it even. It wasn't right in her mind, someone that always helped others through their pain, as he had done for her, as he had done for Kagome, that he himself suffer silently in the shadows. Her thoughts were cut off as Kagome's ear-piercing scream tore through the night, waking everyone. Kagome woke in cold sweat, panting hard as her heart beat wildly in her chest. The others immediately crowded around her. Shippu, who had been scared to death by her scream seeing as he was right next to her, recovered relatively quickly and began tugging on her hand. Kagome, what's wrong? He cried worriedly as Kagome continued panting. Sango and Miroku were the next to approach her. Are you all right? The monk asked. What happened? Inuyasha spoke, for practically the first time in 3 days. Kagome looked up at each of their worried faces and smiled, tears of relief and happiness forming on her eyes. Naruto, he's still alive. Meanwhile, a certain blonde-haired umbu slowly, painfully opened his eyes, meeting the familiar blood red of a certain nine-tailed demon who gave a fanged grin. You always did need my help, didn't you? Foolish mortal. Chapter 26, A Challenge. Naruto stared into the ruby-red gaze that stared straight back at him through the darkness, dancing with lit-up amusement. Slowly, a great feeling of fear and trepidation beginning to coil around his chest as he slowly began to look around the immediate area. No, this couldn't be happening. He settled his eyes once again on the greatest demon to have ever walked the earth. Kyubi. He whispered, his voice hoarse and painful in his own throat. You always were slow, but I never thought it would take you this long to figure it out. Came the demon's voice in the same low rumbling tone Naruto remembered since almost 7 or 8 months since he last heard it. There was a bright glow for a brief moment and then a woman. Even I believed that you were faster than that, foolish mortal. Came the condescending tone that was distinctly female as a woman, with bright flaming red hair that cascaded down her back, completely straight and impeccable, walked out of the shadows. She held a cruel smirk, and was dressed in a blackish-red form-fitting armor, which left her stomach and her arms exposed. Naruto slowly rose, his mind seemingly in a daze, his body numb to the pain his stiff muscles and creaking joints brought to him. Slowly, the events that took place when he was last conscious returned to him. The Kyuubi looked at Naruto. She had a pretty good idea of just how he had gotten to this time. She was no fool. When she was still sealed within him, he may have naturally lived through the ages, with her constantly regenerating and rejuvenating his organs so that they would not age, keeping him in all likelihood, immortal. However, she was no longer sealed into the boy, and the most his body would have been able to live without any illnesses caused by old age would be 80 or 90 after that. His system would have began deteriorating, meaning that he would most likely die when he was 110 or 120. So, she knew he had arrived here using alternative means. And there were only a handful of ways for him to arrive, and he was actively pursuing one. It didn't take a genius to put the pieces of the puzzle together. So, if she estimated correctly, while to her, the fall of Konoha was about 4.5 millennia ago, to him it was just under a year ago. Therefore his reaction to her saving him would come in 3, 2, 1. No. Naruto spoke, his voice not but a whisper. No. He spoke again, his hands moving to clutch his head as he started shaking, falling to his knees as his words of anguish and despair escaped his lips. No, 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 no. He yelled, his chakra spiking due to the torrent of emotions that came to him. The floodgates opened and his entire soul felt as if it would tear itself apart from the great amount of pent-up emotions he had held at bay. All he wanted was peace. He was so tired, all he wanted was rest. Why could even something as simple as this was denied him? Kyuubi smirked. Just as expected. Now then. What's the matter, mortal? Angry that I saved you? Naruto's gaze snapped up to meet her own. His eyes shifting from blue, to purple, to red, and then black to blue at random intervals. His face, though covered by a mask, was obviously held in a vicious snarl of rage. You! His voice, held so much hatred and utter fury, mixed with pain, that Kyuubi had to stop herself from flinching. Not even when he had faced the leader of the Akatsuki had his voice held such malevolence. When he spoke, his chakra flared to even greater heights, the translucent energy growing until it was about 15 feet wide and 20 feet high. His voice held a myriad of different emotions, many that Kyuubi could not place. Why? It was over. I was free, I could see them again. I didn't feel the pain anymore. Why did you interfere? Why? Why? Why did you do it? Why did you save me? His angry roar echoed across the cave and his chakra spiked again to even greater heights. Naruto's eyes met her own in a fury of blue, purple and red. Kyuubi felt a slow taunting smirk tug at her lips. So? She drawled. The little mortal wanted to die. Her words were dipped in acid and venom as her smirk turned into a fake smile of unveiled contempt. I never took you for a coward. Naruto gave off a blood-curdling roar of rage before he rushed forward with all the speed he could muster. Kyuubi didn't even bother to put up her guard, she knew what was coming. Naruto moved fast and in speed many normal humans and even high-level demons would have trouble keeping up with. He fought. He kicked and punched in a mad rage and finally ended his assault as he charged 2 Rasengan in each hand and slammed them into the kitsune's chest, sending her flying back, hitting the far wall of the cave, which gave way under the stress, burying her in earth and rock. Naruto panted, his breath coming in heaving gulps of air. The entire cave was silent for but a moment before the area where Kyuubi had fallen exploded in a bright flash of crimson light that dwarfed Naruto's entirely. Blue met with red. The woman's features, once graceful and regal, were now feral and wild, her hair whipping around in harsh winds caused by her increase in power. She grinned, her enlarged canines showing through her closed lips as her eyes shone with predatorial amusement. My turn, was her amused statement. In a flash, her claws were ready and she vanished into thin air. If Naruto's speed was inhuman, then hers was that of gods. Before Naruto could do anything short of breathe, 3 jagged claw marks tore through his armor, across his chest, then again across his back, his right thigh and his entire left arm. He gasped in pain and had to adjust his footing as his legs nearly gave way beneath him. Before he could do much else, however, a firm clawed hand wrapped around his throat and carried him until his back was slammed against the cave wall. He choked on his own blood and coughed violently. He opened his eyes and looked down to find that familiar blood red. He snarled, the sound coming out in a very demonic fashion for a human. Kyuubi, however, remained unaffected as she smirked and caught his right wrist, in which he had charged yet another Rasengan with which to hit her. "Well, it looks like your desire for death has not completely broken your fighting spirit," she remarked casually. Naruto calmed somewhat, now being held still. He looked to the floor, his face apathetic, cold and distant. Why, damn it? The question, so simple yet so complicated. For a brief moment her eyes seemed to soften before they grew hard again with anger. "Look at yourself," she spat. "You are not the same young man I was imprisoned within all those years ago. You're nothing but an imposter, a shell of your former self." Naruto chuckled mirthlessly and spoke, without lifting his gaze from the cave floor. "So what? It's not any of your fucking business anyway." He chuckled again, his laugh seeming to grow more cold and distant. "You know, it's ironic, all my life I would have given anything to be rid of you. To finally lift your shadow from me. To lift the curse your presence brought upon me." He then looked straight into her eyes, his mask crinkled upwards in his ever-present smile, but his eyes, his deep-sea blue eyes, shrouded in despair, finally revealed the broken spirit beneath the multitude of masks. She forced herself not to look away. She had seen many things during her eons upon eons of life, but never had she seen someone so broken, so utterly defeated in this way. It made her cringe. His smile widened. "And then my friends. I promised myself I would always take care of them. That I'd give everything to protect them, and yet..." His eyes closed in what was obviously a fake smile. "They died, while you lived." Kyubi frowned and sighed. "I hate that smile of yours." Naruto chuckled again. "So do I," he whispered softly. Kyubi let out a small sad sigh, before slowly lowering him until his feet touched the ground and then released her grip on his neck. The wounds she had inflicted upon him were healing rapidly due to her chakra. As she released him, his form seemed to slump as he leaned against the cave wall. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "You still haven't told me why." She smirked and placed a hand in his top vest pocket, pulling out the thong she had given him a few months ago. "Good, you still have it," she remarked more to herself than to him. She then smirked and put the thong back in his pocket. "Find an old little demon named Totosai. He'll know what to do." She then turned and moved to walk away, when Naruto grabbed her shoulder, stopping her mid-stride. "At least grant me the truth, Kyubi. Why did you save me?" The great demoness smirked as she turned and grabbed the front of his vest, pulling him so he was mere inches from her face. Her eyes glinted in the darkness of the cave, taking in his startled expression. "Because Naruchan," she chided mockingly. "I like a challenge," she said before hooking a finger under his mask. She pulled it down and then kissed the blonde umbu full on the lips. "And you are by far the most challenging thing that's come in the last millennia." Naruto only managed to catch a brief glimpse of her smirk before a bright red light consumed him. All he could bring himself to do was smile, the same smile that had graced his features his entire life. That's it for the part 4 of this series. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.